I don't know how you got into video or what your first camera was, but mine was the DVX100. And that camera at the time was really freaking cool. It did 24 frames a second, which no one else was doing at the time. It had a 16 by 9 anamorphic mode to unsqueeze your 4 by 3 so you could actually get some widescreen stuff. And there was even a mod for it at the time called Andromeda, which allowed you to get higher res and higher quality footage out of the camera compared to just the crappy DV tapes that the camera recorded to internally. And Panasonic kind of shook things up quite a bit with the DVX100, especially because it was reasonable for the time and the pricing was pretty reasonable. And now they're coming out with the DVX200. I don't know how, 10 years later or something like that. And essentially this camera is it's like a GH4 but for like broadcast. If like broadcast got the GH4 that they wanted, it'd be the DVX200. So this thing has a micro four thirds sensor, so quite a bit larger than typical broadcast style cameras, kind of news TV stuff. It's a bigger sensor than what they're probably typically used to, and it'll record 4K internally to SD cards. Thankfully, Panasonic didn't go the whole P2 route and charge a buttload of money for their proprietary media. I'm really glad to see they did SD cards. And it's got a fixed lens, so that's kind of the main reason you'd want the DVX200 over something like a GH4 or another camera, is that it's got a fixed lens. It's kind of an all-in-one package, more suited for broadcast, news, documentary, TV, reality, that kind of stuff. And the fixed lens is actually pretty good, all things considered. It's a 2.8 to 4.5 variable lens, and it's got a 30 to 380 millimeter full frame equivalent. It's a 13x zoom. And what that all boils down to is like if you had a GH4, with a lot of people are familiar with, it'd be like if you put a 15 to 190 millimeter lens on your GH4. That's kind of what we're looking at here. So that's certainly a decent zoom range. It's nothing to scoff at by any means, and would probably cover almost everything you would need to shoot. But on the longer end, it does get a little slower around 4.5. But if the original DVX100 is anything to go by, like that, the fixed lens that came with that camera, and even the HVX200, when that came out, those fixed lenses were really nice and certainly good enough for what those cameras were doing. We'll see if this new lens is up to snuff with the larger sensor and the higher resolution video, but I imagine it will be. Panasonic claims that the DVX200 will offer 12 stops dynamic range, which is pretty good, all things considered, but certainly not that impressive compared to some of the other cameras that are coming out now. The stuff from Blackmagic, where they're claiming 15 stops. Red, Alexa, Sony, they're all up in that mid-teen range, even to upper teens in some cases with some of their claims. So we'll see how this all pans out. It's certainly more valuable in this setting if you're doing kind of a run and gun thing where you want to make sure you're not blowing out your highlights or clipping your blacks. So 12 stops dynamic range, it should be all right. It does have stabilization for the lens, which is nice, but again, it's not that special in this case because the lens is fixed. It's pretty typical for most of these camcorder style camera bodies. And certainly not as great as something like if they had built-in stabilization on the GH4, where you're switching lenses all the time, so any lens could be stabilized. Unfortunately, Panasonic hasn't implemented any in-body stabilization on their GH series, which I'm really hoping they do for the GH5 or some other equivalent in that range, because that would be really, really nice to be able to switch lenses and always have stabilization. But hey, you get it on the DVX200. And like I said, it's got SD cards, so cheap media, which is really nice. This is essentially like a GH4 with a bolted-on lens and some of the nice accessories you get with the more all-in-one camera package, built-in NDs, built-in XLR, that kind of stuff. And like I said at the beginning of this, I started video working with cameras like this, the DVX100, the HVX200. Those cameras kind of shook things up and revolutionized things before the whole DSLR revolution. And they offered really nice image quality, but I'm just afraid that now in 2015, this style of shooting is becoming a little archaic. At the time, it's all that was available to people like me who were just getting started out, looking to save some money, get something affordable, but still high quality, right? And you had other cameras like from Canon, like the XL1, which was a very popular camera, but again, camcorder style. And the Sony had the EX1, EX3, and those were all really popular. But then Canon came along and they did the 5D Mark II and offered video on a DSLR. And ever since that moment, there's a place for both, right? There's a time where you need the broadcast style camera body, and I've certainly rented them from time to time. If you're doing a live event, maybe a concert, some kind of live performance, theatrical production, very valuable to have a camera with that variable zoom. Certainly that range is really nice to be able to go really wide or really tight, and just have everything built in right there, so you're not adding audio recorders or ND filters on the lens, having to switch lenses all the time. It's really nice to have it all in one. But for the stuff that I like doing, which is more, I don't know, what you would call cinematic style shooting, where you're taking your time to light things and dress a set and rehearse and go through things and all that, that to me, just that this camera doesn't seem suited for that. So I'm really glad that Panasonic is putting this out there and offering it up for those times where I do need to rent something like this. But I don't think it's going to be a replacement for, some of my other lenses, where I've got 80 to 200 f2.8 or a 50 1.2 or an 85 1.4, those fast lenses to get that shallower depth of field, which, let's face it, that's what a lot of people like to see with video. They want it to look cinematic and like a film, right? And I'm certain you'd be able to do that with the DVX200, but I think it would just be a little limiting. And there's no real guarantee right now on what the low light performance of this camera is going to be. If the ISO and low light shooting on this if it's going to be noisy or if it's going to be like the GH4, we don't really know yet. Not a lot of footage out there. I don't know if there's any footage out there. Nothing. There's some footage that just came out that I saw, and it looked very similar to what the GH4 shoots. So, like I said, it doesn't seem like a reason to upgrade just yet to this. It seems like a totally different path for different people. So, hey, go for it. Do your thing. But again, this too is going to be more expensive. The DVX200. I don't know if they've announced pricing, but I think they've said it's around $5,000. So, what concerns me the most about this camera, I feel like Panasonic's doing what they did with the AF100, where if you remember a couple years ago, Panasonic came out with the GH1, and it was crap when it first came out. And thankfully, some people on the internet decided to hack it and made it better. Panasonic realized they were onto something, so they came out with the GH2, and the GH2 is a fantastic camera. They hacked that to make it even better, but GH2 is really solid. And then they decided to make the AF100, and the AF100, it just was like this, almost the same thing as a GH2, just kind of this camcorder form factor, more money, cost more, but it had some of those professional video production features. And it just, I think a lot of people looked at it and was like, well, I'm going to get the GH2. And sure, the AF100 catered to a niche audience, but that size is smaller. That's less people to buy your product, and so they have to charge more. And in the end, I don't know if they ended up making up the cost on that. I think by most people's estimations, the AF100 was kind of a failure. And so I think Panasonic, maybe they're relying more on the nostalgia, people like me who shot with the DVX100 and really liked it. Or maybe there's still people who shoot with the DVX100, which blows my mind, but they're out there. They exist. So maybe they're offering it as like, oh, the DVX200, finally, the sequel to the camera I've always loved. But that's just not me. I've moved on from that form factor. So we'll see how this all pans out. I imagine it will be popular in the niche audience that it's targeted for, but for I think the majority of people, the people who shoot like I do, the DSLR filmmaker type people who are doing high quality productions without the high-end pricing, I don't know that this DVX200 will necessarily be for them.